In war, the calendar is the first casualty. Time is measured not in days, but in patrols. Not in hours, but in the distance between one heartbeat and the next. Christmas, in the humid, rotting green of Vietnam, was just another day. It was a word from a place that no longer seemed real, a place they called the world. But in 1968, deep in the mountains of Icor, where the war was rawest, the calendar decided to fight back. They say no man chooses peace in the middle of a firefight. They say the engine of war, once started, must consume everything. But they were wrong. On Christmas Eve near the DMZ, the war held its breath. It was not a truce ordered by generals. It was a truce demanded by a song. This is the story of that silence. A silence built from the most unlikely of things. A shared enemy. The monsoon rain and the voice of Bing Crosby. The men of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, were dug in on a miserable, rain-soaked hill designated FSB Sparrow. It was less a base and more a memory of mud. They were ghosts, haunting a perimeter of concertina wire and sandbags. The date was December 24th. The official 36-hour Christmas ceasefire had begun, but no one on the line believed in it. A truce in Vietnam was a tactical pause. It was a chance for the enemy to resupply, to move, to probe. The silence that fell over the jungle was not peaceful. It was heavy, expectant, like the air before a lightning strike. The men knew this. They were veterans not of years, but of moments. They had learned the hard way that the only thing more dangerous than the noise of the jungle was the quiet. The monsoon had been relentless for weeks. Everything was soaked. Their fatigues were heavy with water. Their skin was puckered, and the constant dampness had seeped into their very bones. The mud was a living thing, a red-orange clay that sucked at their boots and smelled of rust and decay. A Marine, 19 years old, from Ohio, huddled behind a .50 caliber machine gun. His name was lost to the manifest, but we will call him the Believer. He was new enough to still feel the sting of the irony. Christmas Eve. Back home, there were trees and lights and warmth. Here, there was mud and leeches and the cold, metallic taste of fear. He was chewing on a piece of stale C-ration pound cake, trying to remember what sugar tasted like. The platoon sergeant, a man they called Stones, moved down the line. Stones was a lifer. He had fought in Korea, and he carried the 1,000-yard stare as if it were standard-issue equipment. He didn't believe in ceasefires. He didn't believe in Christmas. He believed in fields of fire, interlocking lanes, and the cleaning rod of his M16. "Don't trust the quiet," he hissed, his voice a low gravel. "They're moving. They're always moving." The Believer nodded, not looking away from the wall of green that began 20 meters past the wire. The jungle was an opaque curtain. It held everything: tigers, snakes, and men who wanted him dead. This was the context of the war in late 1968. The Tet Offensive earlier that year had broken the illusion of progress. It had shattered the narrative. Now, the war was a grinding, brutal calculus of survival. The morale of the troops on the ground was brittle. They were fighting for the man next to them, for the end of their 13-month tour, for a rumor of a flight back to the world. They were not fighting for victory. They were fighting to not be the last man to die in a war everyone back home was starting to hate. And into this psychological void, on this night, came a sound. It started in the command bunker, where the radio operator was fiddling with the knobs of his PRC-77. He was trying to get a status report from Da Nang, but all he found was static. And then, through the hiss, a voice. It was faint, crackling, but it was clear. It was the Armed Forces Vietnam Network, AFVN, the voice of home. That radio was a technical marvel, a lifeline that pumped the lifeblood of American culture directly into the war zone. It was also a source of profound, surreal dislocation. One moment, it would be a disc jockey spinning the Rolling Stones or the Temptations, and the next, It would be a dry announcer reading new directives on malaria prevention. Or worse, the body count from the day's operations. It was the sound of a nation arguing with itself, packaged and delivered to the men who were living the consequences. If you were there, you'd never forget that sound. The sound of home interrupting the sound of war. The radio operator, a kid from Brooklyn, cursed. He wanted news. He wanted to know if the mail chopper was coming. Instead, he got music. But it wasn't rock and roll. It wasn't the sound of 1968. It was the sound of 1944. The static cleared just for a moment, and the song materialized. A smooth, impossibly calm baritone voice, backed by a gentle orchestra. I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. It was Bing Crosby. The sound, amplified by a small, tinny speaker, drifted out of the bunker and into the rain. The believer, at his machine gun, heard it. He froze. The song was a ghost. It was the sound of his father's living room, of tinsel, of a life he could barely recall. The sensory dissonance was a physical blow. He was looking at a dark, triple canopy jungle that smelled of gunpowder and rot, and he was hearing about snow and treetops that glisten. It was absurd. It was cruel. A few men in the trench line chuckled. A bitter, hollow sound. White Christmas, one of them spat. Look around, man. Only mud we got. But the laughter died quickly. The song wasn't comforting. It was an ache. It was a reminder of the vast, impossible distance between who they were and where they were. And then, something else happened. The rain began to soften. The wind, which had been driving the water sideways, died down. The jungle grew quiet, and the music carried. Across the valley, perhaps 400 meters away, hidden in a network of spider holes and bunkers so well concealed they were invisible, was a platoon of North Vietnamese Army regulars. They were not farmers in black pajamas. They were hardened, disciplined soldiers. They were the 304th Division, men who had fought the French and who had been fighting the Americans for years. They too were cold. They too were wet. Their rations were a ball of rice and some fish sauce. They were living in the earth, and they were masters of it. Their psychological world was the mirror opposite of the Americans. They were not counting down a 13-month tour. They were here until the war was over, or until they were dead. They were fighting on their own soil. They were fueled by a nationalist fire that the Americans, fighting for abstractions, could barely comprehend. Their commander had also heard of the truce. He too saw it as a weakness, an opportunity. His orders were to probe the American line, to find a gap, to test the readiness of the Marines who sat on the hill. An NVA soldier, barely 20 years old, from Hanoi, was on watch. He was listening. He was trained to listen. He could distinguish the sound of an M16 from an AK-47. He could tell the difference between a B-52 strike, which tore the sky apart from miles away, and the thump of a mortar leaving its tube. He was listening for the click of a safety, the rustle of a C-ration can, the soft squelch of a boot in the mud. And he heard it. This music. He did not know the words. He did not know Bing Crosby. He may have heard French carols as a child, a lingering echo of the colonial occupation. But this melody, floating across the dead space between them, was not the brash, angry rock and roll the Americans usually blasted from their helicopters. This was sad. It was slow. It was human. He strained, listening. He reported it to his platoon leader. The officer was confused. Was it a trick? A new form of psychological warfare? He crept forward to a listening post, a hole dug just meters from the American wire. And he heard it too. May your days be merry and bright. Back on FSB Sparrow, the believer was staring into the dark. He saw it, a shadow, a fractional change in the darkness, a flicker of movement just beyond the wire. His entire body went rigid. His hand went to the butterfly trigger of the 50 cal. His thumb found the safety. This was it. The probe. The attack the sergeant had promised. Stones, 50 feet down the line, saw it too. He raised his M16, the barrel steady. The training took over. Decades of doctrine, months of terror, the muscle memory of 1,000 patrols. It all screamed one word: fire. To hesitate was to die. To wait was to let your brothers die. The shadow in the dark froze. The NVA soldier at the listening post knew he had been seen. He raised his AK-47. He was sighted in on the silhouette of the American helmet. He could not miss. 400 meters away, his own commander was waiting for the sound of that rifle to signal the probe. The entire valley held its breath, and the song played. And may all your Christmases be white. The NVA soldier did not fire. The believer did not fire. They stared at each other, two ghosts in the rain, separated by a few yards of wire and an entire world of ideology. But they were united by the music. It was a shared, neutral space. It was a sound that belonged to neither of them, and therefore to both of them. The believer slowly, almost imperceptibly, lowered his head. A nod, a sign of, what, respect? Exhaustion? He didn't know. The NVA soldier, after a long, impossible moment, lowered the barrel of his rifle. Not all the way, just down, from aimed to at rest. It was a gesture more powerful than any treaty. It was a choice. Comment, "I remember the brotherhood," if you know that choice is the true heart of the soldier. The shadow melted back into the jungle. The believer let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. His hands were shaking. Stones lowered his rifle, his face a mask of confusion. He walked over to the believer. "What did you see?" he whispered. The believer just shook his head. "Nothing, Sarge, just a ghost." Stones looked out at the wire, then back at the bunker where the radio still played. The song had finished. Now it was silent night. The NVA officer returned to his command post. He was silent for a long time. His men looked at him, waiting for the order to attack. The music was clearer now, the hymn lifting into the hills. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. The officer, who had been trained in Hanoi and Moscow, who believed in the dialectic of history and the inevitable victory of his people, made a decision that was not in any manual. He looked at his radio operator. "Tell the mortars to stand down," he said. "We will wait. Tonight, we listen." And so the truce became real. It was not a piece of paper. It was a shared vibration in the air. For the next several hours, the war stopped. The men on FSB Sparrow, emboldened by the quiet, began to emerge. Not to stand up, but to sit on the edge of their foxholes. They lit cigarettes, the small red embers glowing in the dark. They talked. They spoke of home. They spoke of cars and girls and the taste of a real hamburger. The music from the radio became their soundtrack. They requested more. The radio operator, catching on, played every Christmas carol in the AFVN library. Across the valley, the NVA soldiers did the same. They ate their rice. They cleaned their weapons. But they did not plan an attack. They listened. They may not have understood the words, but they understood the feeling, the longing, the sadness, the shared humanity. The music had done what the politicians could not. It had reminded them that the man on the other side of the field was, for tonight, just a man. He was cold. He was far from home, and he was listening to a song about peace. This was the technical genius of that moment. It wasn't about the hardware, the PRC-77, or the 50 cal, or the AK-47. It was about the software, the human code. The song was a piece of data that bypassed the training, the ideology, and the hatred. It was a vulnerability in the system of war. It found the part of the soldier that was still a son, a brother, a father. As the night wore on, the psychological weight of the silence changed. It was no longer the silence of ambush. It was the silence of agreement. The men on both sides were participants in a fragile, unspoken contract. We will not kill each other tonight. This, in the middle of the Vietnam War, was the most radical act of all. They had become, in a way, enemies of the war itself. They were not brothers. They were not friends. They were, and would be again, mortal enemies. But for these few hours, they were co-conspirators in a rebellion of peace. They were proving that the machine could, in fact, be stopped, if only for a night. Dawn came on Christmas Day. The rain had stopped. The jungle was shrouded in a thick white mist. It was the closest they would ever get to a white Christmas. The radio operator on FSB Sparrow had fallen asleep. The music had been replaced by the morning news report. The spell was broken. The sky turned from black to gray to a pale, sickly yellow. The believer, his eyes gritty with exhaustion, watched the mist burn off the wire. He could see the jungle clearly now. It was just trees, but he knew they were in there. Stones was already walking the line, his voice harsh again. Stand to, lock and load. The party's over. The men checked their weapons. The intimacy of the night evaporated with the morning dew. The sea ration coffee was bitter. The war was back. Later that day, a patrol would be sent out. They would find tracks. They would find the listening post. But they would not find the enemy. The war would resume. But what of the men? The believer survived his tour. He went home to Ohio. He got married, had kids, and grew old. He never spoke of what happened on FSB Sparrow. It was a secret, too sacred or too strange to be shared. How do you explain a night when your enemy, the man you were trained to kill without hesitation, gave you the gift of life because of a song? How do you explain that the deadliest weapon on the battlefield that night was a melody? The NVA soldier, perhaps he survived too. Perhaps he marched into Saigon in 1975. Perhaps he too grew old and told his grandchildren stories of the war. But perhaps he left one story out. The story of the night he heard the enemy's music and, for reasons he could not explain, lowered his rifle. This is the legacy of that night. It did not change the outcome of the war. It did not save a single village. It did not stop the B-52s from flying, but it changed the men who lived it. It offered a moment of profound, undeniable grace. It proved that beneath the uniforms, beneath the doctrine, beneath the fear, the human heart remained. Stubborn, resilient, and capable of choosing peace, even when it made no sense. The war was a deafening, relentless machine designed to grind humanity into dust. But for one night, in a valley in Vietnam, that machine was defeated by a song. The real battlefield is not the land. It is the soul. And the soul, sometimes, wins. The war is over. The jungle has reclaimed the fire bases. The mud has swallowed the wire. But the memory remains. The echo of that music, the proof that even in the heart of the darkness, there is a longing for the light. If this story moved you, write below. We never forget. The guns are silent now, but the song, that song, still plays.